On this episode of Booked on Rock, we explore the British invasion of '64, how it all began, the iconic bands that rose to fame, and the lasting impact it had on rock and roll, film, and fashion. That's coming up next. Welcome back to Booked on Rock. I'm Eric Senich. Great to have you back. This episode's guest is Gene Popa, author of the book British Invasion '64, the year that changed rock and roll forever. And man, did it. Welcome to the podcast, Gene. How you doing?
Thank you so much, Eric. I'm thrilled to be here.
You write, quote, "By the last day of December 1964, it was unfathomable to imagine what American pop music would be like without the British. The sounds and the fan bases of the two nations would become unified forevermore, and suddenly the world around us seemed to be in living color at last." Take us back to what the world was like heading into the year 1964, just before the Beatles arrived. It's a world, as you say, that was black and white.
If you were to go back to January 1st of 1964, it was a very gray world. People were still mourning the death of John F. Kennedy. Music, rock and roll, just had kind of seemed to be tamed. It had lost a lot of its edge. No one would have ever predicted that a British artist, a single British artist, could have had a major impact in the year ahead, much less a slew of them. And it goes to show you just the incredible impact of the invasion when it did hit. Nobody was expecting it, not even the Brits. It came out of nowhere. It came at the perfect time. It couldn't be replicated. It couldn't have happened before or after. It had to happen at that moment in time.
The popular narrative is that until the Beatles arrived, no British rock and roll artist had managed to make a dent on the American charts, but that's not true. There were UK rockers who broke through in the years prior, but only briefly and none with the impact of the Beatles. However, there was one artist you mentioned who had the potential, and that was Cliff Richard. He is, I believe, the third top-selling artist in the UK, only behind the Beatles and Elvis. Talk about him, and why do you think he wasn't able to have the same impact here in the US?
Well, first of all, it's hard for people in America to realize the importance of Cliff Richard. If you were to go to Britain, he is as well known as any of the four Beatles. He has been a major star since 1959, still continuing to have top 40 hits in Britain. For reasons I can never fathom, other than two minor hits in the American top 40 in the 60s, he could never break through to the American market in the 60s. And I don't know why, because he did some great music. If I had to equate him with any American artist that people might recognize, it would be Ricky Nelson. I said similar styles. Everyone thought Cliff was going to be the one to break through in America. And he tried and tried and tried, and he just couldn't. By 1963, he was throwing his hands up in the air and saying, "We're never going to get it through over there. They have what they need and they don't need us."
So still a mystery.
Yeah. It wasn't until the 70s that he started having a couple of hits on the US charts, but he didn't last beyond that here in the US. And again, he, if anyone, should have been a major star. It should have been Cliff Richard.
How much influence did Kennedy's assassination in November of '63 have on the British invasion, in your opinion?
It's hard to say specifically what the assassination meant in multiple levels, but clearly it had an impact and an existential impact, especially on young people. JFK was the president of youth. Young people who were too young to even vote looked to him as their leader. And when he was killed, it was the most gut-wrenching experience of their young lives. And they had a void to fill. Nobody knew who was going to fill it. And certainly no one thought it was going to be some British guys. But people were knocked for a severe loop with the assassination, and things were uncertain for quite a long while after that. So it's not surprising that when people were stirred by the invasion, they threw themselves into it wholeheartedly because they needed something to believe in again.
Yeah, it seemed like a much-needed release of emotion that the youth of this country must have had, and the Beatles were there to bring it out. Yes,
and as I mentioned earlier, the invasion had to happen at that time. And it literally had to happen when the Beatles appeared on Sullivan on February the 9th. If they'd have been there a week before or a week after, I don't know if their impact would have been quite the same. But that was that perfect moment in time where everything just erupted.
February 9th, 1964, the legendary Beatles performance on Ed Sullivan. 73 million people watched, which you'll never have that happen again with all of the splintered choices that people have. Streaming services, YouTube, Netflix, you name it. There's no way, I don't think you could ever capture that many people in one setting.
I doubt it.
Ed Sullivan happily told the story of how he first learned of the Beatles. How did he learn of them, and how much of what he told is a good tale and how much was true?
At its heart, his story is truthful. But in Ed's telling, he happened to be in England in October. He had done a show there, which, interestingly enough, had Cliff Richard as one of his guests. And once it was over, he's flying back to New York, and he was at the airport, and there were about 1,500 teenage girls in the rooftop observation area screaming. And he knew the British Prime Minister was at the airport that day, and he commented to an airport official. He said, "I didn't realize the Prime Minister had this kind of a youth following." And the official said, "Oh, no, they're for the Beatles." And Sullivan said, "Who the hell are the Beatles?" And he said, "They're the most popular pop group in all of Europe right now, and the girls go crazy for them." And as Sullivan tells it, he said at that moment that, well, if they're that popular in Britain, I want to bring them to America and make them popular there. The fact of the matter is, he had booked them several months earlier. He had a booking agent in London who would often sign various British acts to the Sullivan Show. Ed liked a lot of British acts, particularly comedians and some musical acts. And his booking agent rang him up and said, "These boys are big over here, and I think your audience would like them." So Ed signed them up. Beatles manager Brian Epstein said, "We don't want a lot of money for this, but we want 3 consecutive dates on the show, just like Elvis had." And for Ed Sullivan, that was an easy give, because even if they flopped on their first appearance, he didn't really have to show them the 2 weeks after that. He could have just paid them off and said, "We're not going to put you on the air, boys. Sorry." But if they were a hit that first week, he had them for 2 more weeks afterwards. So it was a good gamble for Ed.
Paul McCartney quoted in the book on the plane flight over to New York, "Since America has always had everything, why should we be over there making money? They've got their own groups. What are we going to give them that they don't already have?" What was it that they did give American audiences that they didn't already have? Or was it just right place, right time?
In a real sense, they gave America their rock and roll back, because, as I mentioned, rock and roll by early 64 had been tamed. It was the era of the teen idol. The major record labels did not allow wild men to be putting out records as they had in the 50s. So you weren't hearing Little Richard on the radio. You weren't hearing Jerry Lee Lewis. Even Elvis had the rough edges smoothed off him. He was making frothy movies and singing songs like Rock-a-Hula Baby instead of Heartbreak Hotel. There was an entire demi generation of kids who didn't experience that original rock and roll firsthand. And all of a sudden, here come these guys who have not necessarily doing the music of the 50s. They had the energy, and they were playing a lot of rhythm and blues songs that a lot of white kids in America weren't hearing, even though they were contemporary songs. But a lot of white kids were listening to Motown in early 64. So what they brought to Americans was their own history. And they said, "This is what you're giving up. You need to embrace this." It's understandable that on the flight over, Paul and all the Beatles were really terrified about making it in America. That had always been the goal. They always knew they were never truly going to be as successful as they thought they could be unless they could be big in America. But nobody had been big in America yet from Britain. And they were deathly afraid that they were going to flop, and that was going to be their chance, and that was going to be the end of everything if they didn't make it.
Talk about the impact radio had on rock and roll's emergence in the 50s here in the States, particularly Alan Freed, but in general, the jocks were left alone to play what they wanted. And with that comes huge exposure of this music to teens.
Well, Alan Freed got his start playing an overnight show in Cleveland, where he loved to play rhythm and blues songs, and the dirtier and the grungier, the better. Now, his sponsors weren't too happy being associated with rhythm and blues because that was considered race music and not for white audiences. So Freed said, "Oh, no, this isn't rhythm and blues. It's rock and roll." They said, "Oh, okay, that's fine then." So a little branding change. And all of a sudden, he's got a hit radio show where high school kids were staying up long after their bedtimes and listening to their radios because they could not get enough of this music. And radio in much of the 50s was kind of like the Wild West. You had certain rules you had to follow, but within those parameters, DJs could pick whatever songs they want. They can get crazy on the microphone. And as a result, a lot of music that wouldn't ordinarily get picked up was getting played in major markets. Sun Records, which was this little label out of Memphis, was suddenly getting radio stations in New York and LA playing their stuff. And that began to come to an end in the late 50s when the top 40 format was set, meaning that your program director says, "Here are the 40 songs we're going to play this month on the station. Don't deviate from this list." Now, there goes a lot of the small, grungier record labels.
You write, Quote, when the Beatles first hit the shore in America, there were other boots on the ground right behind them. Among the big bands to emerge were the Dave Clark Five. And I know of them well because I'm a Van Halen fan. So I know Eddie Van Halen wanted to make rock and roll music, not because of the Beatles, not that he and his brother Alex were not fans of the Beatles, but there was something about the Dave Clark Five, and that turned him on to rock and roll. You say
Yeah.
few artists mastered the business side of rock as well as Dave Clark, a true innovator. Talk about that.
Well, I think even Dave would admit he's not much of a musician. He can pound the drums, but even he would hire session drummers for the Dave Clark Five recording sessions. He was a businessman, a natural born businessman. He worked up a deal with the other band members where they were all on salary and he would get the lion's share of the money. He also owned their music publishing. And a deal where any of the members of the band wrote a song, Dave would be co-credited as co-writer. So he covered himself very well there. But his best deal was the agreement they came to with their record label, which, they were doing well in ballrooms and in clubs. And the label, I think it was Columbia in Britain, wanted to sign them. And Dave said, no, we don't want you to sign us. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to record our own music and pay for it. And then you're going to lease it from us. And then after 10 years, we're going to own all the masters. Well, the label thought this was great. They said, we don't have to pay for their recording sessions. And in 10 years, nobody's going to want old rock and roll. We could throw it in the garbage. Nobody's going to want it. And as a result, Dave Clark is a very, very, very wealthy man today.
Wow. Now, let me ask you a question because I did an episode on the Zombies, and they did the same thing. They leased their music, and that was their manager. And I'm drawing a blank on his name, but Dave Clark, he was the one making all the decisions?
Yes.
Wow.
He
I
also
wonder.
was their formal manager, so he had complete legal control over the band.
Okay. I wonder if the Zombies got that idea from them or the Zombies manager, because it's exactly what they did, which is a brilliant move. If your music stands the test of time, you then have publishing. You own the publishing to all those songs.
Yep.
Smart move. Yeah. This episode's guest is Gene Popa. He's the author of the book British Invasion 64, The Year That Changed Rock and Roll Forever. Massive success of these bands like the Beatles and Dave Clark Five. You got the Kinks, the Who, the Stones. There was a lot of money to be made, but little of it was made by the bands themselves. How were record labels divvying up the money that came in, and why so little to the bands?
Well, as they had their stacks of money on the table, occasionally a few coins would fall onto the floor and the recording artists could scramble for those. In Britain, the Beatles and most of the other recording artists received 1 penny per record sold.
Man.
In the United States, they received 1/2 of 1 penny. They ate that half of a penny, and then their manager would get automatic 25% right off the top. Whatever was left was divvied up 4 ways by the other Beatles. So even though the Beatles sold 25 million records in America alone in 1964, they didn't make a whole lot of money from record sales. Now, John and Paul made a lot of money as songwriters because songwriters get paid a lot more than the artists. And of course, the Beatles were making top dollar as a touring act. So they were doing all right financially in those regards. But yeah, as far as record sales go, nobody was going to be making bank off of that.
Wow, you hear artists complain about streaming and how little they get for a stream.
Yeah.
That's rough. Who was Herman Kennan, and why was he a threat to the British invasion?
Herman Kennan was the president of the American Federation of Musicians. He was both a perceived threat, but ultimately one of the greatest heroes of rock and roll. When he became president of the union in the 50s, he inherited a problem with the British Musicians Union. And that was that the BMU almost never allowed American musicians to play in Great Britain. Their argument was you're taking paying work away from British musicians by bringing Americans over. Now, there were some exceptions. Louis Armstrong was always welcome. Singers like Sinatra and Tony Bennett could always come and sing. Classical musicians were welcomed as well. But jazz, country, later rock artists, no. Said, you can't come here. It's very difficult to get any permission to get into the UK. And Kennan wanted to change that. But the British weren't interested at all in making that change because I think a big part of it was also Britain had been the greatest empire in the world in the first half of the 20th century. After World War II, the United States took that over. And I think for a lot of Britons, their pride was damaged. So I could see the BMU saying, no, we're going to keep this. This is still ours. We're going to have our musicians. We don't need yours. You've taken everything else from us. Anyway, Herman Kennan wanted to break that lock. And he saw the British invasion as the way he could finally do that. So he gave an interview where he disparaged the Beatles and the other British acts and argued that the Beatles were essentially singers, they weren't musicians. He said, he has a great line. He says, "We could find 4 kids from Yonkers or Tennessee who could do the same thing they do. Good luck with that."
Wow.
But he said, if they come back to the United States, they're going to have to leave their instruments at home and just sing because we're not going to let them come play. And the BMU had no problem with that because they were like, doesn't change what we do here. Well, Kennan was very smart. He gave that interview and it became a big news story. And a lot of young people were up in arms about this. Now, it was an election year. If you're under 21, you couldn't vote, but you could still exert pressure in your own household on your parents. You could still write letters to the editor. You could write to your congressman. And soon enough, there were enough members of Congress who were concerned that this issue might somehow be used against them in the election. They kicked up to the White House, where Lyndon Johnson was getting his own pressure from his 2 teenage daughters who were Beatles fans. And now all of a sudden the Beatles and the other acts weren't going to be allowed to tour in the United States. So he turned to his Secretary of Labor and said, "Fix this pronto." So the US and the British Musicians Union negotiated. And at first the BMU was not willing to budge, but they're feeling new pressures of their own. The head of EMI, Sir Joseph Lockwood, had many connections with the British government, and he began working those levers. Also, the British artists were selling a lot of records overseas and making a lot of money for the British government in taxes. And one of the investors in the Beatles merchandising arm was a distant member of the royal family, but he had connections with the crown. So all of a sudden, the BMU started getting a lot of pressure they hadn't felt before. And very quickly, they changed their tune and said, "Okay, everybody's welcome. You come to Britain, we'll go to America. Everybody's one big happy family."
All right, we got to talk about the Stones. I love the Stones, so let's talk about the Rolling Stones. Their manager, Andrew Loog Oldham, hyped them as the anti-Beatles. Now, that was something that seemed to be okay with not just the Stones, but the Beatles, too. They were happy with that good boy, bad boy images that they were given.
Well, the Beatles loved the Stones. They had discovered them when the Stones were doing a club residency in London, and they would go see their shows. And it was actually George Harrison who recommended Dick Rowe, the president of Decca Records, "You should really listen to these guys. You might want to sign them. They're good." And of course, Dick Rowe was smarting because he had very famously turned down the Beatles in 1962. And in his letter, he said guitar groups are out. And
yeah, well, and Dick Rowe's the guy. He's the guy that signed the Zombies because of that.
Yeah,
that's a story too that was funny. Yeah,
he was getting so much grief over that.
Right.
And so you could say that the Stones could owe it to the Beatles that they got that recording contract. John and Paul wrote a song for them that was their second hit in Britain, "I Want to Be Your Man." The Beatles later covered on their second album with Ringo.
That's a cool piece of trivia there, Stones Beatles trivia, yeah.
Yeah, and Andrew Loog Oldham had done work for the Beatles. He'd worked for Brian Epstein earlier in the Beatles' career, and they were friends with him. And he came up with this idea, says, there's too many bands that want to be the Beatles. We're going to be the anti-Beatles. The Beatles were like, "That's great. Go with that." So they were more than happy to help perpetuate that notion.
Interesting that the American musicians who shared an affinity with British invaders were blues artists, right?
Yes, blues artists who had been largely ignored by white America during its entire existence. But in Britain, Howlin' Wolf and Muddy Waters were gods to people like Eric Clapton. These middle-class British white kids, that somehow that music spoke to them. And when these kids came to America and played that music, the American kids were like, "This is fantastic." And not only did they discover the blues through acts like the Rolling Stones and the Yardbirds, but you started seeing blues artists appearing on mainstream television. They'd be on Hullabaloo and Shindig, which prior to the British invasion, just you couldn't even begin to imagine that happening. But by 65, 66, there were very well-known faces on TV.
There was a time there where all those blues artists would go to the UK, and I think there was a famous club or area there. It was like an island that they played in where they had a huge following, and that's where they could make their money.
They definitely had an audience, and so did 50s American artists like Chuck Berry and Carl Perkins, who didn't have much of an audience in the U.S. by the mid-60s, but in Britain they were still stars.
The Beatles and Bob Dylan in the 60s, the mid-60s, particularly is fascinating. You talk about how Dylan deserves study during this period of his career. We know how much Dylan influenced the Beatles. They were big fans of Freewheelin' Bob Dylan. There were pictures of them with that album.
Yeah.
And that's the album from 63. But what did Dylan think of the Beatles? Did the Beatles influence Dylan to go back to his rock and roll roots, do you think? I mean, he was in rock bands before discovering folk music. So what are your
Hmm.
thoughts on that?
Yeah, actually, growing up, Bob Dylan's musical idol was Little Richard, and he had played in a rock and roll band in high school. He discovered folk when he went to college, and he fell into it hard. But by 1964, Dylan was being hailed as the voice of his generation, and he didn't like that at all. He didn't want to be anybody's prophet or martyr, and he was anxious to do something different. First of all, he loved the Beatles. When first time he heard "I Want to Hold Your Hand" on the radio, he said he just absolutely loved it. Although he misheard it as "I Get High,"
Uh,
and so when he first met the Beatles and he brought along some herbal remedy, he assumed the Beatles were well versed in it, but they had never had it before.
yeah.
But he thought the Beatles were great, and they got along personally so well. They had the similar vibe in their humor. But what really pushed Dylan into rock and roll were the Animals, because they had recorded an old folk and blues tune called House of the Rising Sun, which Dylan himself had recorded on one of his first albums as an acoustic version. But when he heard the Animals do it, Dylan said, I realized then and there, this stuff can be electrified. And he
Okay.
plunged right into adding electric guitars and organs to his music.
You write, quote, the American response to the British invasion was a study in contrasts, expected yet unpredictable, cautious yet bold, routine and yet startling. All of it made for a musical melange that resulted in a top 40 radio listening experience that was as eclectic as it ever had been, or perhaps ever would be again. And it really was all over the map. Talk about
Mm-hmm.
the artists that had success in 1964 amidst the British invasion. You mentioned Motown earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Motown was huge.
Motown really broke free in 1964. It was coincidental, but very fortuitous, that Berry Gordy had planned to do a big push for the label in the summer of 64. He no longer just wanted to be a top black record label. He wanted to be a top label where both black and white kids were dancing to their stuff. So he did a huge push, and he had Mary Wells, who hit number one. He had Smokey Robinson, the Miracles. He had Marvin Gaye, the Temptations, and he had the Supremes. The Supremes nobody could predict, because they seemed to come out of nowhere, and they just started having number one hits left and right. They were matching the Beatles with number one hits right and left. But we tend to think back now, 1964, okay, you had Motown and you had all the British acts, and that was pretty much it. Three of the biggest stars on the charts in 1964, all of whom had number one hits, were Louis Armstrong, Dean Martin, and Bobby Vinton. In the midst of the British invasion, they were still hitting number one. Again, what shows you how eclectic the radio was at that time. You could turn on your top 40 radio, but you'll hear some Frank Sinatra, and then you'll hear the Rolling Stones. And people didn't think that was strange. It was all what was popular.
That was really cool. That's like pirate radio, too. Pirate radio, the Beatles got a lot of exposure through pirate radio, I'm assuming.
They did, yes, because the BBC had a lock on radio in Britain, and they would play rock and roll during certain hours of the day, although that expanded throughout the 60s, because as it became the more predominant musical form, their listeners were clamoring for more of it on the air. But you didn't have 24-hour rock and roll radio in Britain at that time. What you did have were some entrepreneurs who got some ships and went out beyond the border on the water and had a transmitter and commandeered some radio waves and started broadcasting their own music. And they would play anything and everything. The pirate radio stations were hugely influential in the mid 60s. By 67, the government had shut them down. But by that point, the BBC was really expanding their radio play of rock and roll. So it kind of made up for the loss.
Yeah, kids would listen to their transistor radio as they fell asleep at night.
Mm-hmm.
Had it right there on the pillow, listen to pirate radio.
And
The
since the 50s, there had been Radio Luxembourg, which
yeah,
was a radio station with enough wattage that at nighttime, if the atmospheric conditions were right, you could hear it in Britain. And Paul McCartney's father hooked up an extra long cord to a pair of headphones and would plug them into the radio in the living room. And as Paul would go to bed, he put the headphones on and he could listen to the music as he drifted off to sleep. And one of the things Radio Luxembourg did was play recordings of Alan Freed's show. So Paul was hearing, and the other Beatles were all hearing things that you couldn't really hear anywhere else in Britain.
and the British invasion affected more than just what we heard on the radio. There were movies and television series like Spy TV became huge.
Mm-hmm.
Talk about the British invasion's influence on fashion and film and pop culture.
Well, thanks to the music, it seemed that all things British became very, very popular in the United States. You also had the James Bond movies, which were huge hits. In 1964, Sean Connery was the number one box office star in the world. And you started getting some British shows like The Avengers and Secret Agent Man being shown on American television in prime time. And design and fashion was suddenly very important. Nobody thought of London as anything other than a gray, stodgy old city until about 1965, when suddenly it became swinging London, and everybody wanted to know about the Carnaby Street fashions and what's the latest sound that's happening there. And you think about how the city on the other side of the ocean was having such an impact in every quarter of the United States. There were kids in Alabama who were just gaga about what was happening in London. It's just amazing to think about.
I mentioned before we started the episode, closest thing that I could experience that would be like that was the early 90s, the grunge movement, and
Yes.
Seattle. I mean, I guess that's the closest, and that's probably the last time we've ever had that kind of a seismic shift in
Yeah.
not just music, but culture and the way people dressed and all that. It's
The thing is, you can't plan for it. Nobody planned for grunge. The record industry had been trying for years after the British invasion to repeat that with all sorts of things. And they had success in terms of moving some records, but nothing had the cultural impact of the invasion until grunge, which again, nobody saw it coming.
the signs of the British invasion slowing down came sometime like 66, maybe 67. It had come to an end. What do you think caused its decline? Was it just something that ran its course, or was it overexposure?
Well, I would actually say the British invasion, as we tend to think of it, ended by about mid 1965. Most of the British artists who broke big in the US in 64 had the last of their hits by that point, and a new wave of artists were coming through and were starting to have their hits. The Yardbirds, the Hollies, the ones who hadn't hit in 64 were starting to hit in 65 and 66. And music was changing. There was also the realization that it no longer was the British music scene and the American music scene. It truly had become mixed together. And it was just considered rock and roll as a whole. So you no longer really need to differentiate between this is a British invasion act. It's just a rock and roll act.
What's amazing is what music was like in the early 60s and what it became by the end of the decade. Two different worlds.
People tend to think of the early pre-Beatles 60s as being a very bad time for music. But in a lot of ways, it was a golden age. I mean, you had Roy Orbison, you had all the girl groups, you had Solomon Burke. I mean, there's a lot of great music on the air. What you didn't have was the excitement of a 50s Elvis. And the Beatles brought that excitement. That is what changed things in ways people hadn't been expecting. I mean, there were thoughts that rock and roll was just going to fade away. And in a lot of ways, it was because it was expected that young people would outgrow rock and roll. That, okay, it's a kid thing. You're in high school, enjoy it. But when you go to college, you pick up a serious musical form, folk or jazz. Those were the two most popular. But after the British invasion, people kept listening to rock and roll. I found a statistic that in 1963, university bookstores that would sell records said that folk and jazz accounted for something like 85% of their record sales. And by 1966, rock and roll was 90% of their record
Wow.
sales.
And Elvis, I think you mentioned in the book too, Elvis, when did he come out of the army? What year?
1960.
Yeah, 60. So he had changed.
Well, Elvis came out of the army a little more jaded with life. He was more willing to just kind of go along with what his manager, Colonel Tom Parker, told him to do. Colonel Tom said, "We're going to put you in these silly movies and you're going to get a paycheck for $1 million for each of them." Elvis said, "All right, I'll take that money. And here's the soundtrack you're going to record." "Okay, I'll record these songs." Every now and then, Elvis would kind of slip the reins off and cut something that was reminiscent of his 50s work, like Little Sister or Marie's a Name, which had real unbridled raw energy. But by and large, he was making music that sounded like Elvis, but wasn't the Elvis we knew back in the 50s. As we know, Elvis kind of drifted into a state that he wasn't well served by.
Yeah, and he met the Beatles, or the Beatles met him, I think, at Graceland, and that might have been mid 60s, maybe.
Actually, they met in Los Angeles. Elvis was there making a movie.
That's right.
Beatles were there on tour. So they set it up as a summit, and the Beatles came to Elvis's place, and there were all sorts of rumors. One of them is that they all played Monopoly using real money. Paul says that did not happen. But the story goes is that the Beatles came in and they were so gobsmacked by seeing Elvis. I mean, he had been their idol as kids. They just sat there quietly and they weren't saying a word. And Elvis was sitting there, and finally he got up and said, "Well, nobody's going to talk. I'm going to bed." And that broke the ice. And they spent the next couple of hours. They were playing pool with Elvis and his buddies in the Memphis Mafia. They were hanging out. They supposedly pulled some guitars out. And my God, if only somebody had turned a tape recorder on for
Yeah,
that.
yeah, they did a little jam session together.
Yeah, it was a moment that had to happen. The Beatles had to meet Elvis, but it's a shame they didn't meet in a place where Elvis would have been more inclined to say, let's go in the studio. Let's cut something.
Exactly. I was just about to
A
say
song for
that.
me. What do you got?
Can you imagine if they collaborated on a song? Maybe how would that have affected the rest of the decade for Elvis?
Yeah. Yeah. It
Yeah.
would change things.
What if, right? The what ifs. What do you think the British invasion's most lasting effect on rock and roll is?
Boy, that's a big question. Well, first of all, the music that still lingers to this day. I joke that people are born knowing the Beatles in their DNA. Even if you say, well, I'm not a fan of the Beatles, you know their music. And you know the music of the Stones. And you can probably name a song by The Who and by the Kinks. It continues to influence music to this day. Virtually any big star at some point will tell you, oh, yeah, there's this song that I really like. And I try and do a song that sounds like that. And it's a song from the British invasion. It also changed culture. We were a very, how to best to describe it? You look at the early 60s, you look at America, everybody was kind of the same. He dressed the same,
Conservative.
same haircuts, very conservative. And if anything, the British invasion said, just be you. Grow your hair long, wear what you want to wear, just have fun.
Be silly, like the Beatles had that silly sense of humor.
Yep.
Yeah, I would say the music stands the test of time. Looking back at the styles, watching the old clips of the Beatles or the films from those days, it's great to look back on it in a nostalgic way, but the music stands up. That's really, to me, what
Yes.
really is the ultimate proof that, the British invasion, it didn't go away then, and it never has gone away because people
No,
still listen to that
to
music.
blow people's minds, the Beatles averaged 2 albums a year and 3 standalone singles that weren't on any records.
Wow.
We also did that while in 64 and 65 making movies, 64, 65, 66, doing world tours and doing television appearances and basically not having a time of their own. They were busy being Beatles all this time. You think of artists today, major artists who you can go 5 years between album releases.
British Invasion 64, the year that changed rock and roll forever, can be found wherever books are sold. Look for it at your nearest bookstore. You can go to bookedonrock.com to find your nearest independent bookstore. So if you have one nearby, look for a copy there. Where can people find you online, Gene?
Well, I'm on Facebook under Gene Popa Author, and one of these days I'll get my website up and running.
All right. Well, people can reach out to you through Facebook. I'll put the link in the show notes page. And I look forward to having you back on again because there's another book we want to talk about, and it is all about the Beatles, correct?
It is, and in a certain sense, it's a bit of a sequel to the British invasion. Although the focus is entirely the Beatles, but it's sort of the second act of the Beatles after the British invasion.
Yeah, I look forward to having you back for that maybe sometime. A few months from now in the summertime, we'll have you back on to talk about that one. Thanks so much, Gene.
Thank you, Eric.